Hey everyone, in today's video I'm going to show you my two favorite plugins. Now these two plugins I use in almost every track, whether I'm doing drums, bass, guitars, vocals, you name it. I put these two plugins in almost every track. And the two plugins that I use are the SSL Channel by Waves, and the other plugin that I use is the CLA76. So these two plugins, and I use it in this order with the exception of vocals. Vocals, I will put the compressor first, the 1176. I put that first and I use the Bluey setting. But for everything else, this is the pretty much the two plugins that I use. When I do guitars, instead of this one, what I use is, let me just turn this off here so I can have all three of them up. But for guitars, what I use instead is I use the Renaissance X. This one, which is another compressor. But these, basically with these three plugins, I can pretty much do a whole mix. All the other plugins is just to add flavor, like saturation, transient designers, things like that. But basically these are the two plugins. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a few examples of how I use these plugins in a mix. Okay, so let's start with the drums. And it's going to be just a pretty quick mix. This is just to show you how I use it. So I'm going to loop, let's loop chorus 2. And as you can see, I have everything zeroed out. And I have just one auxiliary. And I have everything bus to this drum aux. All right, so I'm going to hit play. And we're going to start. Okay, so the first thing I do here is that I do a low pass at about 40. Then I do a boost and I keep it at 60, which is the default. Okay, I do a healthy boost. And then I pretty much try to match it or maybe put a little bit more top end at 8K. And now I'm going to play around with these two settings for 1 second. Okay, so right there you can see that the kick has more punch, more power, but also because I added so much high shelf, it's bringing all the bleed also. So it depends if I'm going to gate this or not. I will probably make that decision. I most definitely will gate the snare, and I'll show you that in a second. But for this, it depends, because I do like bleed in there. But if it's too much, like I can't control the kick, then I'll come back and I'll add a gate, and then I'll see the difference. But for now, I'll just leave it the way it is. Okay. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of some of the low end. And this is where the kick becomes more of a modern kick, or that modern sound that you hear. So let's go ahead and do that here. And it's set at 500. I like to go down to 400 and then I play around with it. Okay. I leave the cube pretty narrow. Sometimes I go all the way, but I'll leave it at the default. But I take out almost all of it. Like here it says minus 15 dB. That's how much I attenuate. Okay. So let's take a listen and see the difference. Perfect. Awesome. See, so you can hear the difference where if I wasn't doing anything to the low end, you hear it's more of a like that old kind of like 70s Led Zeppelin type thing, which sounds great, but for today's modern music, that low end is usually taken out and it has more of that punch. So let's put it back. Okay, and so far everything is sounding pretty good. And another thing that I do, since I do hear 8K, I tend to boost a little bit at 4, but not too much, just a little bit. Let's take a listen. There we go. And that's sounding pretty good. And that's pretty much it. So let's do a quick before and after. This is before. And you can hear the difference. It sounds great. And I didn't use any samples or anything like that. I do bring in samples later, but I bring in samples after I get a really good drum mix overall. When I feel happy, then I add samples just to enhance it. Now let's bring in my second favorite plugin, which is the CLA76. And then what I do here, I bring slow attack, fast release, and then I start to play with the input and output. So basically what I do is, what I want is I want the initial transient to go through, right? So let's go to, let's zoom in. So I want this initial transient to go through. That's why the attack is slow. It's not catching it. If the attack was a fast attack, then what it'll do is it'll catch it right away, and then it'll adjust depending on my threshold. But I don't want that. I want this transient to go through, and then because it's a slow attack, I want this, the tail end, to be raised. So then it sounds more consistent, it sounds punchier, and more in your face. So that's basically why engineers add this compressor to almost everything, and why they use a slow attack and a fast release. So now let me just go back to loop the second chorus. And the reason why I loop, this is a side thing, but the reason why I loop the second chorus most of most music, and I focus there when I'm mixing, is because that's where I feel the song is at its peak in terms of like, it probably all the instruments have already been introduced. So you can use the first chorus, but sometimes there are songs in which there aren't any instruments introduced in the first chorus. They kind of wait for the second chorus. You can also use the outro chorus, but the outro chorus sometimes has variations. So, and what I'll do, if they do have variations, I'll take care of that later. But I usually find that the second chorus is really where almost everything is at and what the song is really about. So I focus on that. But obviously, then I go through the whole song and I adjust and I make adjustments as I go along. But to get a basic framework, like a good static mix, I focus on the channel 2. That's not channel 2. That's chorus 2. Chorus, the second chorus. Okay. So now I got that loop, and now let's start compressing this kick. So the input and output. So basically what the input does is you're telling it how much you want to compress. And I usually like to do around -3 dB for kicks. And then the output, I try to adjust the output so it can match if the compressor is bypassed. Okay, so that's why I leave it at default, but then I start to work on this. Okay, so let's take a listen. Okay, so right there I got the input at a good place where it's hitting around -3. Now it's not never perfect, so between -3 and -5, that's good. That's great. You don't want to go past -5. There might be some peaks that it will, but for the most part, that's what I'm looking at. So I think I got it in a good place. Now let's focus on the output. So the output now I'm going to adjust so that I can level match. So I'm going to bypass it. and then I'm going to engage the compressor, and then I'm going to try to get it more or less that the volumes are pretty much the same. Here we go. Maybe just a tiny bit, but it sounds pretty, it sounds similar, so that's good. What I don't want is for this to be really like off, like let's say it was like this, right? Now if you hear, now you can hear the difference. See, you don't want that. You just want it to pretty much match the volume. Let's do this one more time, but I think I got it in a good area. Okay, and when the compressor's on, you hear the punch, right? It gets punchier, and it helps the mix. It helps the kick cut through the mix better with this compressor. So I'm happy with this where it's at. What I'm gonna do, this is something I do. I just bring it down to about -3, and then I bring in the snare, and then I start adjusting these two. And then everything else, the rest of my mix will be leveled around these two. This will help me at the end not to have some headroom. So when I send it to the master engineer, he has some headroom to work with. Because if I had this at here and then I mix everything around it, it's going to be really, really loud. And sometimes I even lower it to -6. But, and also I check the waveforms to make sure that they're you know, this is how I like to have my waveforms. Again, another side thing, and that's okay because sometimes the videos is on one thing, but I may touch upon something else, and for some of you, it's something that you already know, and you can just, you know, disregard it. But for some of you, it could be helpful. So I just bring it up and kind of mention it. But when I get a mix, if I see something, let's say the snare looks like this, right? That's too low for me. The volume is too low, so I will adjust it, you know, to about there. Or let's say that I get a mix and it's like this. Okay, for me that's too loud, so I adjust it. But because I was the one who tracked this, you can see pretty much how I like. See, the bass actually I probably tracked it a little too loud, and so I'll probably, you know, when I'm doing my mix prep, I'll probably lower it like that. Okay, my clean guitar is pretty good. Maybe I can bump it up a little bit, maybe like that. And if I'm doing the left and right, when I'm tracking, it's the same exact setup. Amp, guitar, everything. You know, volumes, you know, and all that stuff. It's the same. And I track in chunks. So I basically, let's say I'm tracking, you know, verse 1 here. I'll track verse 1, and then I'll go and I'll track the right. I don't track the whole, you know, the whole left guitar and then come back to the beginning and track. No, I do it in sections. So if I'm, you know, trying to gain stage this and I do 1.7 dB here, then I'm going to do the exact 1.7 on the right. Okay. All right. This looks good. This looks good. See, this is a synth. And here originally I had a MIDI, but I printed this down because I sent it to another mixer. So he wanted the printed version. So, but if I'm mixing this, I would probably bump this just a tiny bit like that. And look at my vocals. My vocals look pretty good. Maybe making it a little bit like that. So if I do that, I do the same thing. See how I split my vocals: verse, chorus, bridge, outro. So it's the same exact setup. So I would do the same thing. Okay, so you get the idea. Sorry I went on a little rant there, but why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning this is because this is the reason why I do this. Okay, and I know that -3, between -3 and -6 works for me because of the way I prep my mix, if that makes sense. Okay, let's move on. Now I'm going to bring the snare top, and the way I mix, I always start with the kick, and I always start with everything, you know, zeroed out, right? Everything is zeroed out. But then as I'm mixing, whatever I mixed previously, I leave it there. So I don't mix in solo, even though I just mixed the kick in solo, but everything else will be, you know, will be left on. So I'm going to bring on the snare top, and then I'm going to hit play. I'm not going to solo it and listen to it unless I'm trying to hear some specific things of it. But for the most part, I leave it. Okay, here we go. Okay, I may bring this down 1 dB. Maybe one more. I'm not sure, but again, see, mixing is really balancing. That's really what it is. A mixer is just you're trying to balance everything, and I'll come back to this and balance it again later on. But for now, I'm trying to get a good kick snare relationship going on. Okay, I may just go back up to right here and right there. Okay, perfect. And now let's get started. So again, because I use the same 2 plugins, and if you notice in Pro Tools, I have those 2 plugins right here because I used it for almost everything. So I can do one of 2 things. I can just click here and go there, or I can hold down Option or Alt, drag it, make a copy of it, and then I select it and I go to factory default, click it and click it again. And then it sets everything to factory default. It depends, but they're both pretty quick. It's just a shortcut to kind of work fast because you want your workflow to be quick. Okay, so now what am I going to do to this snare tom? All right, first I'm going to high pass about 100. All right. And then I always boost 200. And if you watch many videos on how to mix drums or how to mix modern like rock drums, hard rock and metal drums, you will see that almost everyone bumps 200. All right. And then I'm also going to bump 8K, and I'm going to start to work with that. Okay, here we go. Okay, so if you notice what I did there, I was lowering the volume not on the channel track, but on the plugin, because I'm trying to level match, because I don't want the volume to pretty much, you know, trick me into thinking it sounds better. Because if you add, if you're adding stuff to, you know, if you're adding stuff on a plugin to a track, and it's getting louder, and you think, oh, that sounds good, lower the volume on the plugin and try to level match it, and then see if it actually sounds good. Because something that's louder is perceived to sound better, but sometimes it's not. So that's why I tend to do this. Okay, let's continue. So you hear how with those 2 moves, it sounds a little clearer. It sounds punchier. There's a nice top end to the snare now, whereas when I bypass, it sounds kind of like there's a blanket over it. Take a listen. Okay, and I can probably lower it just a little bit more. There we go. Awesome. Okay, so the same thing that I did with the kick, I'm gonna do with the snare. I'm gonna bring this to 4K, and I'm gonna add just a little bit. This helps with the stick attack. Okay, perfect. I like with that sitting. All right, awesome. So now let's do the compressor. Okay, and then the same thing. I want slow attack, fast release, and then the slow attack, same reason. I want the initial transient to go through, and then I want to raise everything else up to match it so it can be nice and even and loud. And -3 to -5. Here we go. Okay, that's sounding pretty good, and I'm probably matching it. But if you notice, it's clipping. Okay? It's clipping in some parts. That's okay. That's not a problem. Pro Tools has this headroom thing where if it's clipping, it's not, you're not getting digital distortion. It still sounds good, so it's okay as long as it's not just really crazy, like, you know, clipping. But here it's fine, so I really don't worry about it. Now, obviously, I do other things to the snare and to the kick also. I add some saturations. Lately, I've been using Smack Attack. Yeah, I'll show you real quick. It's a Waves plugin, Smack Attack. Yeah. And what this does, it kind of brings up the transient a little bit. Not a lot, just a little bit to give it more of a little attack. I'll show you what I'm doing here. And then also I will probably maybe gate this. Let's see how it works. Okay, I'm going to gate it. I know the videos about my two favorite plugins, and I'm using other plugins, but I kind of want to show you what I do to how I gate this. And lately I've been using the silencer, and there is they're not presets, but you can select what you want to gate. And here I'm gating the snare top. All right, and let's take a listen. Here, I will probably solo it because I'm not mixing right now. I'm just trying to get rid of the bleed, and I don't want the kick bleed to kind of, you know, I won't be able to hear it in a sense. So let me just solo it. Okay. So what I'm doing there, as you can see, it got rid of the bleed, right? But the default of it, let's go back to the default. Okay, the default was here, -12. And it got rid of the bleed. But what it did, it choked the snare. And I don't like that sound. Listen. Okay, but then down here, that's where all the rest of the, you know, the bleed lives. So if I bring it, so what I tend to do is I bring it all the way down until I hear the bleed, and I bring it just enough until the bleed is gone. If there's a little bit of bleed, that's okay, because with the rest of the drum mix and everything else, you won't hear it. Okay, there. See, that sounds pretty good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to listen to it to see if it got rid of, if the bleed is also getting rid of like the body of the snare, and I don't want that. So let's take a listen. I think that sounds pretty good. And now let's see how the kick and snare sounds together. There we go. That sounds pretty good. Now, this is what we started with. And this is what we have now. Okay, so you hear the difference. So it is louder. Okay, you really can't help that, but you can hear the difference there. Okay, that's how I use my two favorite plugins, which is these two. Let's put this one here because that one is first, and then let's put this one here because this one is second. And that's pretty much how I use these two plugins. If you like this video, thank you for supporting the channel. You can click like and subscribe. And until next time, happy mixing.